All right, you guys, here it is, 2023 XMR 700. I said I was going to find one, and I did. I ended up buying it in Mississippi at Brookhaven Power Sports. Got it out the door for about 12 grand paying cash. Have to pay tax on that once I register it in Florida, obviously. And great dealership to deal with, in and out, no bullshit. Didn't try to sell me a bunch of crap, so I like that. All right, so this video is going to be like I just bought it, haven't even ridden it yet. It's got half a mile on it. We're going to do a walk around. Try to make some observations, things like that. And we're going to pull off some of the plastics that easily come off and take a look at some stuff underneath. There's been a lot of reviews on this bike that are just reading you the brochure and they're useless. So I'm going to try not to do that. I'm going to try to actually make some technical observations and share that sort of stuff with you. Things we'll be doing over the next couple weeks is putting the 33s on here, seeing if they'll fit. We're going to weigh these stock XPS Swamp King tires, see how heavy they are. We're going to be testing it, obviously. Today, I'm going to go over it and do my delivery inspection. I call it the post-delivery inspection, where I check all the snorkel fittings, I check all the vent lines, I check all the fluids before I ride anything ever. So I'm going to walk you through that after I show you some of my just out-of-the-box observations. Hope you guys find this helpful. All right, so I did some very mild disassembly. I pulled off the snorkel shroud that goes right here, that has the dash. I pulled off the two side covers. I pulled off the seat. I pulled off the cover that sits in here. That needed actually tools. It is it's two screws here. This little guy had these two Torx in it. That's the only thing that required tools. And everything else came off really easy. The plastics on this bike, the plastics on this quad come off easier than any other quad I've had. Probably easier than a Honda. Definitely easier than any of the previous Gen 2 or Gen 1 Can-Ams. All right, so I'm gonna start working through the things that I initially started looking at when removing the plastics. First, I'm gonna show you three things I think Can-Am kind of messed up on. Number one, this bolt in my transmission is about to fall out. That's how it was just sitting there almost, falling out. So that's typical Mexican quality there for you, that's good. Premium, brand new machine, bolts falling out of the transmission, great. Also, this vent hose that just hangs down here, this is part of your gas tank breather system, and they have it hanging down here where it's obviously going to be in a lot of mud and water. I'd like to relocate that or plug that. And up here, if you look at the radiator overflow, it also just hangs down, and it hangs down a lot lower than the rest of the snorkels. So that means you could be sucking mud and water up into your radiator. Now, why would they do that? Well, that's because they don't want coolant blowing on the rider, and they don't want gas blowing on the rider or on the exhaust manifold, where it could cause a fire. However, when you go super deep like us Florida people do, having vent lines hanging down in the mud and water is never acceptable. Something I just have to include in the first video, everything I buy, is actual ground clearance measurements, because manufacturers lie and lie and lie. So let's see the front ground clearance. At the front of the bumper, it's really good. It's almost 15. But you can see the frame tapers down right there, right behind the back control arm. So let's see what it is after the taper down. If we look back here, we're not 15 anymore. We're about 13 inches under the front at the lowest point. It is nice and flat, which is good. It's not like the stupid Polaris where you have a lot of ground clearance in the front and the back, but it's real low under the big fat engine. We don't have that going on, which is awesome. I think that the rear ground clearance under the hitch, again, we're really high under the hitch. We're at 15 and 5/8, but if we go farther forward, more realistically, we're at about, hard to do with one hand, about 13 and 3/8 under the center at the lowest point. Pretty good. So it is pretty close to what it says in the manual, in the brochure. It's stock preload settings, right? I haven't touched these at all yet. They are 2 clicks from the softest. So that gets us into talking about the overall layout in this machine. It is totally different than a Gen 1 or a Gen 2. It's completely new, it's completely different. There's really not a bunch of meaningful comparisons to make because it's so different. So I'm gonna start pointing at a few things I've noticed about the frame and the overall layout of the machine. So if you look up front, the structure of the machine stops right here, right? This is a big pipe, it's fairly thick, supports the differential and stuff, it stops here. Everything forward of here, I would call it crumple zone. It's really thin, really small pipe, and it does tie into these loops, but this is all body work from here forward. This is where the meat stops. You can see that the way the front control arms mount is very much like an X3, where they're kind of cantilevered or single sheared off the front of the frame. I don't love that, but it is what it is. Also, if you look at the bushings, they're not the shitty old school Can-Am style bushings. These are more like a Honda style bushing, so they shouldn't be as squeaky. They're a real natural rubber looking bushing, not those little plastic inserts. So that's really cool. Differential is really big. And because of that, you see how the drive shaft has to kind of come up at an angle out of the engine to go up to the diff. It's actually a pretty good angle there. So I don't think this bumper is going to be very robust. I don't recommend pushing people out with it. If you want to add a winch, you don't need a winch plate. It'll bolt right here to these 4 holes. So there's like a factory winch mount built into it, and your roller would mount here, right? And your winch would mount down here to these 4 holes. Something kind of cool Can-Am does, but I'm telling you, it's all some pretty thin steel. So we'll see how it holds up to a really strong winch. Of course, mine is brand new and there's just paper and stuff all over it still. You can definitely tell they were trying to save weight. When you look at a lot of stuff on here, I'm just gonna pull all this crap off. This is thin, these tabs are very thin, etc. So yeah, let's move on to the back. You can see you got this tube lattice work here, kind of going up. Pretty complicated looking frame design. Gen 1 was a really weird frame design, and then Can-Am had a unique thing going. They went a little more conventional with the Gen 2, and now this looks a lot more like most ATV frames where it's just tube work everywhere. So now you have your Yamaha style one-piece engine and belt box type thing. That's pretty cool. I like that for simplicity and keeping the belt really sealed. There's your belt drain. What do we have more to talk about this frame? Tie rods look pretty big. The tie rod ends are kind of dinky. You can see that there's no nut on that tie rod actually. There's just a nut on one side of it. So that means those threads are gonna get worked, which I don't really love that. There's like a nut on both sides of the tie rod, so you're not, your threads are locked down, they're not actually working, so that's kind of annoying how that's kind of exposed threads there. The differential does look huge. Of course, it has that front locker. There's your power steering unit back here. These shocks look really small, but again, it's an ATV. I'm used to side-by-side stuff more lately, but they do look like they have a ton of travel, so we'll see how it rides. There's your fancy headlights. Hopefully they're very waterproof. They should be on the XMR. See how this frame, this is what I mean by it's kind of goofy looking, right? Like, see how this cap sits in here? And these welds, the way they look and the way it goes together. It's got a very, I don't know, it's got a very cost-saving feel to it. A lot of stuff feels kind of cheap when you look at the frame of this thing. Moving on to back here, a lot of the same type of stuff. There's just, thin pipe and trussing everywhere. It's a very complicated frame. The shocks do go up as high as possible to get you a nice, really long rear shock. So that's kind of cool. But I mean, there's just, look at these welds. They're just not beautiful looking welds, I gotta say, anywhere on this thing. This back part isn't a subframe either like you get with a Honda. It's kind of all one piece. Like on the Honda, you remove this whole subframe and take the diff out. This is not, that's not gonna be the case here. It's all one piece from back here, the very back of it, all the way up to here. This is all like the main structure of the machine. The exhaust looks pretty good. Back shocks look good. CV angles aren't terrible. The CVs all the way around do look kind of small. But really long shocks. You have brakes just on one side because there's no differential back there, obviously. You have no rear storage, which is annoying because you have the big muffler there and the low rack, so there's no storage box. So where do you put your snatch rope, right? The cooler's gonna go here. That's a little bit annoying. What else to tell you about this thing? It does combined braking, of course. Your throttle modes here. Floorboards are crazy well supported. They're trussed front and back, which is something I've never seen before, and it's all welded. That's pretty interesting. This is all part of the frame right here. You do have another electrical junction up here, high and dry. Here's another little fuse box with some relays in it, and a whole slew of connectors on this little thing built off the side of your belt exhaust snorkel. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, and skid plate. It has this plastic skid plate that runs the whole bottom. It feels pretty good. It's fairly thick plastic. It's nice and slick. It does have some access points cut out for doing maintenance and stuff like that. However, how do you remove it, right? I don't see any bolts. It's got these little rivet things everywhere. Kind of reminds me of the Yamahas where the skid plate's not really designed to be easily removed. So that is a little weird. Also, what is this thing right here? It's like a big piece of metal on the frame, at the bottom of the diff. I don't know if it's supposed to be for harmonics or something, but that's interesting. The front diff is mounted up fairly high, which means that you get a lot of axle angle. I don't think you're able to lift the front of this very much just because of how high the diff already is. And it's a giant differential. It's the same diff you get in a side-by-side essentially. So that's kind of crazy how high up that differential mounts. But I'm sure it's very strong because it's out of a side-by-side, or you would hope anyways. So it's getting hot here. I had to turn the AC on. So hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll try to speak up. One thing that a lot of people are concerned about is the weight on this machine. It does weigh about 30-40 pounds more than the old equivalent XMR. And I'm comparing it to the 2022 XMR 570, which was really a detuned 650. And the reason I'm making that comparison is because they both make about 50 horsepower. So compared to that one, this thing is about 30 pounds heavier according to Can-Am's dry weight. Of course, I'm gonna weigh it myself because I don't trust their dry weight at all. Now, these tires are likely a lot heavier than a Mayhem. They're really thick. So once I weigh the tires, that'll tell us if a lot of it's the tires. You can see that Can-Am tried to save weight wherever they could using very thin metal and stuff on the front bumper and keeping a lot of it open. So why is it heavier than the outgoing model if it's this Gen 3 platform and Gen 3 frame that's supposed to be stiffer and lighter and everything? Well, it is bigger. So this thing has a 2-inch longer wheelbase than the old models, which is good for tire clearance and stuff. And it's also 7 inches longer if you go tip to tip than the old model. It's 3 inches wider, so it's got a lot more girth to it. It's a lot bigger of a machine, and it does feel big. It feels like somewhere between the old long wheelbase Outlander and the short wheelbase. It takes up a lot of space in the garage. All right, just one more thing to talk for anything on a test drive. It does have some storage up here. It's kind of goofy. There's no drain that I can tell. It's got this magnetic phone holder thing in here, which I think I can remove by taking that bolt out because that gets in the way of everything. I'm not gonna keep my phone in here because it's gonna get water in it. You can see this gasket is not gonna be a complete seal. But it does give you some switch locations up here, and it gives you 2 USB-A ports, which is really cool. I don't think I've ever seen that on a 4-wheeler before. The tools actually go up here. They just don't put them there from the factory. You have to move up there yourself. I wish this had a drain though, so I'll probably end up having to drill some holes in it because I'm sure it'll get full of water. So if you're still watching this far in, you're probably thinking, why did this idiot buy another Can-Am? He hates all the Can-Ams he buys. What is he thinking? Well, that's mostly true. I've had really bad issues with all my Can-Ams. Differentials exploding, transmissions exploding, belts exploding, everything leaking, electrical problems, etc. However, my 2021 Renegade Outlander 1000 was a lot better. It did have some belt leaks, and the dealership messed up the clutches when they went to warranty the belt leaks, and I got rid of it because I didn't want something the dealership had all apart and messed up. That was its major flaw, but also the Renegade didn't have the ready to relocate, and it didn't have very good fender coverage, so I was constantly getting covered on that thing. Couldn't ride a passenger. So this is a lot more practical, and it's a new vehicle to test, and that's what I like to do. I like to get new things and test them. So how long will I have it? It depends how long it takes to start falling apart. So if you made it to the end, you probably want more info, check out the Patreon page. I'm posting little updates on there daily.